He predicts that in about 100 years, the GDP of the United States would exceed the GDP of Great Britain. Clear in Smith, it's very clear in The Wealth of Nations, he associates government with violence. The whole American colonial and independence experience was kind of directed at those bastards, the Brits.
Hello and welcome to this IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Daniel Klein, who has written an article in the latest edition of Economic Affairs, Adam Smith's Hopes for a Liberal America, co-written with Michaela Luran. In the article, Klein explores a fascinating question about Adam Smith's perspectives on the emerging American Republic in 1776, arguing that Smith was genuinely optimistic about America's future, despite numerous reasons for pessimism. Daniel, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off by talking a little bit about that sort of contrarian perspective that you have proposed in the article. Why do you think Adam Smith would have been particularly optimistic about America's future?
He makes some remarks about the future importance and wealth and greatness of America. That's, I guess, the main thing we're going on. It actually is interesting to me that you say there's a conventional wisdom that Smith was pessimistic. That could come from John Ray, his original great biographer. I think the book came out in 1890. And he had that reading of Smith on the colonies. And I don't really know why. But I don't think modern Smith scholars so much think that Smith was pessimistic. Let me read an important passage for our paper. He speaks of the Americans. Now, this is 1776, when the first edition of The Wealth of Nations comes out, March of 1776. Really, the revolution is underway and conflict has broken out. And then, it's a few months later that the Declaration of Independence comes. Thomas Paine's Common Sense had appeared in January of 1776. So it's in the thick of things. And so what he says in 1776 is that about the Americans, from shopkeepers, tradesmen, and attorneys, they are become statesmen and legislators, and are employed in contriving a new form of government for an extensive empire, which, they flatter themselves, will become, and which, indeed, seems very likely to become one of the greatest and most formidable that ever was in the world. So that doesn't sound pessimistic, at least in terms of one of the greatest and most formidable empires. And there's not just this passage, there's other passages. There's a very interesting passage where he predicts that in about 100 years, the GDP of the United States would exceed the GDP of Great Britain. And he got that about dead right, by the way. So we do see these predictions of a very powerful and rich and great America. He certainly, I don't think, was confident that anything would go smoothly, but he definitely saw grounds for hope. And that's what Michaela Luran and I write about in this paper, why he would have seen things in America that gave him this more optimistic, outlook on it.
That's really interesting. And what reasons do you give for this optimism? Why do you think Adam Smith himself was optimistic that America would be particularly successful economically in the future?
I think he saw their sort of enterprising, resourceful guys, making a plan, like he says, contriving a new form of government. That's the word he puts it. And bent on that. And these were basically Englishmen. And he gives a lot of credit to the mother country for the culture and the spirit and the ethics and the, invigoration and outlook of these Englishmen who were in the North American continent. and he's looking at the documents of the colonies themselves, how they're governing themselves. I think he's also looking at the literature coming from various thinkers and leaders of the time. And I think he reads what accurately the situation, that it is actually a very, I don't know what word you want to use it, a kind of pro-commerce, pro-individual liberty, pro-rule of law, pro-Republican spirit and plan, and that there wasn't going to be a way for Britain to stop it. I don't think he was in favor of Britain trying to wage war. I think he was a let him go kind of guy, along with several others, of course, in Britain, although they didn't necessarily come out and put it very bluntly that way. But I do think that's what Burke was arguing for. I think it's what Hume favored, although he died in 1776. Um, Smith, Hosea Tucker was that way. Um, Richard Price was that way. Um, so there were people in favor of let him go. I think he was one of those people. Because he saw there wasn't a way to try to maintain control over it. He saw that it was inevitable. They talked about this tremendous ocean between them and how impractical it was to try to pretend to govern. And so all these things, like he was, yeah, I think rather optimistic. Now in our title, I think our title is a little bit stretching it. Adam Smith's hopes for a liberal. I think, that's liberal in the Smithian liberal, allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way, sense of liberal, classical liberal. And I don't think he's specifically saying they're going to land on something very liberal. He's not specifying one way or the other, but obviously he's expecting enough liberalism for prosperity, right, and rapid growth as in a powerful country. So, yeah.
I think that's really interesting, especially within the historical context of the time. So let's talk a little bit about the context. So The Wealth of Nations was also published in 1776, I think just a few months before American independence had actually been declared. Do you think that Smith was particularly involved and interested and sort of actively aware of what was going on over in America? And do you think that had some influence on that? I mean, I've always been of the view that Wealth of Nations isn't particularly unique in terms of its ideas. I mean, a lot of it is sort of drawing on a lot of the literature that had been written in the past, but Adam Smith almost certainly was the first person to bring all of those ideas and those concepts together and communicate it in, I think, quite an effective way. So do you think that there was some influence there? Do you think he was really aware of what was going on in America? And how do you think that influenced both his perspectives over what was going on and also his own work over in the UK?
I think that's right, that he's drawing a great deal on the past. It's both a book for the times and a book that's a general treatise and philosophical statement, really. So it's like all of the above. I do think he was kept up quite a lot on the affairs. And I think he was in London a lot of the time that he was finishing up this first draft of the first edition of The Wealth of Nations. And in touch with people and advising, politicos, statesmen, legislators, and so on. In 1778, in fact, he writes a memo about American affairs that shows a great intimacy and concern about it. So yeah, I think he was very well informed. Of course, anybody had difficulty being very informed about the latest pamphlet because of the problems, but yes, I do. And I think he got the spirit. I think he got the spirit right. We talk about a couple of the American thinkers, James Otis, who was writing in the 1760s, and John Adams, who was 60s and 70s, up until 1776. And you see in their thought, and of course, this is just we're suggesting emblematic, representative of a broader wave of colonial American thought, of these principles that we talk about in the paper. We mark out 5 principles as kind of like main points of contact or concurrence with Smith that we see in these two particular thinkers, James Otis and John Adams, that we sample a bit as representatives of something broader in America. Subsidiarity, that is, and it's not as though they use the word subsidiarity. That, of course, is kind of a Catholic social doctrine word, but it's a good word for letting the local units manage their own affairs rather than trying to reach down from above in a very top-down fashion. So letting the decentralized players do their things, in this case, decentralized governments, but also other organizations, civic organizations and companies and so on. So subsidiarity, kind of a localism, religious freedom, limited and balanced government, free trade and open inland commerce. So that's sort of like free market. And the necessity of virtuous governors for the preservation of liberty. In other words, the connection between virtue and liberty in politics. And you see these themes very strongly in the American writers. You see these themes, strongly in Smith's work. And so we're just kind of drawing these, concurrences, just to suggest that they're part of one broad vein of thought. That is to say, both Smith and his friends in Great Britain and the Americans who were moving into the break with the United Kingdom, Great Britain. So we talked then about how we see these principles expressed on both sides of the Atlantic.
It's interesting. And specifically with those 5 principles, so subsidiary, religious freedom, limited government, free trade, virtuous governance, which of those do you think Smith really saw in the ideas that were influencing the American Revolution, influencing the establishment of an American government?
I think all of them. I mean, that's why we made this list. I mean, and I think they are all there. I mean, I think he got it right, basically.
I mean, they certainly are in the American Constitution, but were they as prevalent in the early sort of establishment of the government? I mean, of course, there were so many debates and discussions around what that government could look like. Do you think that Smith saw these principles sort of dominating those arguments? I mean, we sort of didn't really know which way the American government could have gone. It could have the Constitution could have looked very, very different than what it does. What it ended up looking like. So do you think he sort of foresaw that these principles would actually dominate?
I don't think he was super confident that some kind of stable political order that institutionalized these principles would necessarily happen and succeed and persist. But I do think he saw that people were serious about these kinds of principles. Now, of course, it's not all that there was in the colonies. There was slavery in the colonies. And of course, he's horrified by that and condemns it strongly. But he sees that the men who were leading this war for independence, which is a better name for it, I think, than the American Revolution, because it's more of a secession, really. It's not like the French Revolution. It's not as though the guys from Massachusetts went over to London and cut off the king's head or anything. They just wanted to secede, basically. And he saw, I think, in the leaders and in the discourse and the justification for the separation for independence, these kinds of principles. Now you're absolutely right that a lot could have gone wrong or worse, and it was very unclear what would shake out. Very possibly multiple big countries in the continent, not as big as the United States, and sticking together. And later on, the Lower South secedes in the 1860s, and then we get the Civil War. And also there's the whole issue of whether other European powers would have come in and played more roles that complicated things and destabilize things. Um, so yeah, I think you're right that there's not it's not clear what the future picture is. I don't think he was suggesting, oh, I foresee like a continental unified country that's going to be functional and stable and have these five principles. But even if it were parts and broken up some, which it very well could have happened, um, these principles were still quite strong throughout most all of the colonies, I think, and especially in New England and the mid-Atlantic, I would say.
And specifically, one of those five principles on religious freedom, I think, is particularly interesting. It wasn't really something I thought of comparing because, of course, in the Great Britain and the United Kingdom have a very, very different relationship with religion and with the Church of England and what that looks like in its relationship to the state. What do you think Adam Smith really made of that on religious freedom, especially the fact that they didn't establish a church? Do you think that that was significantly important to his optimism?
I do, actually. And so in The Wealth of Nations, Smith talks about a place where religion and government had never been interconnected or hand in glove. And he said, in such a place where this had never started, it would be best to keep it open, free market, basically, and let churches compete freely on a purely voluntary basis. And that the sects, even though some sects, of course, tend towards, fanaticism, tend to refute each other and check each other. And this will lead actually to, as he put it, candor and moderation. And I think he had Pennsylvania, for example, in mind. In fact, he mentions Pennsylvania, and he certainly had the American colonies in mind. Um, and so he's very pro free market and he's very optimistic about a free market in religion, actually, which gives you a very strong cultural optimism from Smith that, even something as fractious as religion can actually calm down and we can learn to live with each other and we can have multiple faiths and so on. Now, it's not as though he says in The Wealth of Nations, oh, and here where we have an established church, we should have disestablishment. We should repeal or abolish that. He doesn't say that, but that's fine. He has a very strong sense of history, and history plays a role in terms of what's proper under the circumstances, the place in history. So he could say, free market here, but maintain the established church here. And of course, the American experience had a lot to do with religious freedom and religious pluralism and so forth. So that definitely is a strong connection, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially when considering the differences in the historical context. I mean, what sort of the 1700s looked like in Great Britain for religious freedom, very, very different, starkly different to what I think many had hoped for and what eventually I think occurred in America. You touched on this before, but I do think it is worth exploring a little bit more. These sort of connections between some of these thinkers. You spoke about James Otis, but also people like Adam Smith and Benjamin Franklin. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of evidence that you've come across or that you have that Smith and those particular thinkers were sort of influenced by one another or thinking or even talking directly, and what you think is of interest intellectually, what you think Benjamin Franklin perhaps influenced Smith on or vice versa?
Okay. I know some about those questions, and there's some literature certainly about it. I do want to point out that our paper is not saying that Smith, our paper is about saying Smith had these views. He looked at America and he saw like a reflection, like a correspondence. We're not actually saying that Smith influenced America. But still, of course, it's an interesting question you ask. Yeah, I mean, there were connections, and Ben Franklin I certainly had met Smith. He had been in Britain some, and he was rather friendly with David Hume, good, Adam Smith's best friend. Hume was super influential on the Americans going into the War for Independence. Hume's a bit earlier, so he has more of an opportunity to write in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, um, to influence people like John Adams and like James Madison and many others. Um, so that's for sure. I think Smith had some influence, certainly, on the founders in 1776. But, the Wealth of Nations just appeared. So before that, there would have been the Theory of Moral Sentiments. I think that would have had some influence, not a ton, some. And then later on, after 1776 and heading more into the constitutional period, as well as the early republic, I think that, then the Wealth of Nations and Smith again has quite strong influence. Yeah, and is he learning from others from America? There's not so many to learn from so early. I'd say, like I say, there's Ben Franklin, but it's mostly going the other way, the learning.
It's the teaching that's more influencing. Thank you. I think that's fascinating, especially because I think that those connections are, I think, rarely ever made, really, when it comes to those early intellectuals. And of course but of course they would have had a relationship with many British intellectuals. It definitely makes sense, especially where London was such a hotbed for a lot of those intellectual conversations.
Yeah. No, I know a little bit about some of the other British thinkers, and it's really interesting to think about their attitudes towards America and how they went about advancing, like Let 'Em Go, which I think again was Smith's and Burke's actual view. They had rather sly ways of doing that, I think, because I don't think they wanted to just declare it too bluntly.
Do you think they would have received some backlash from the establishment for being supportive of American independence?
Yes, I think if they dumped on fighting the war, you know how war is, right? They would receive backlash, and a lot of people would be super alienated. And it certainly wasn't their style, either Burke or Smith, to be alienating to people.
And also, I suppose Smith was writing about these ideas and concepts rather than commenting as a journalist sort of on the day-to-day ongoings of political occurrences. So I suppose it perhaps would have taken away from his ideas. And speaking of Smith's political philosophy, I think very specifically, you reference this in the article, the sort of idea of natural liberty and how that had sort of a specific relationship with what the American, the initial founders of the American country and the American Constitution were actually trying to create through the Constitution. So could you talk a little bit about that? How did sort of the ideas of natural liberty end up manifesting in the creation of the Constitution?
Yeah, well, the whole American colonial and independence experience was kind of directed at those bastards, the Brits. Right? So it's kind of got this like healthy, don't tread on me is the American slogan. Don't tread on me. And there's a very strong recognition that government is force. Government is the institutionalization of coercion, and even more the initiation of coercion. And that's very clear in Smith. It's very clear in The Wealth of Nations. He associates government with violence. Now, that's not to say he's all against government or he's an anarchist or anything like that. I think he thinks government's inevitable and, in a sense, necessary, and our responsibility is to make it better rather than worse. Generally speaking, though, that does mean smaller or less intrusive. And so that means more liberty. And he had a very clear idea of liberty as others not messing with your stuff, just like you have a duty not to mess with your neighbor's stuff. Then others not messing with your stuff is liberty, and in particular, the government not messing with your stuff. That rings very clearly, actually, from the Theory of Moral Sentiments already. So this was a very strong, classical, liberal, liberty-oriented body of thinkers, set of thinkers. And the Americans were really keen on it. and even often overly simplistic about it, I think, with Thomas Paine and the consent theory of government. Smith did not really subscribe to that, neither did Hume. Um, but as a slogan, but also as a deeper, practical, realistic principle, liberty is central. Absolutely.
Yes, it absolutely is central, and I think it's probably why. Well, I think the American Constitution is probably one of the reasons why liberty as a concept is at least preserved so much more over in America than in so many other countries. I mean, I've often said even things like freedom of expression, when in the United Kingdom, at least, we now have people being put into prison for over 30 months for social media posts, and in the US that would never happen. And just thinking, it's awful.
I mean, it is. They did predict, when they came out, when they had rumors about what they had done in Philadelphia, someone said, we hear, because it was all supposed to be very secret, the draft constitution, we hear that it's a republic. And Ben Franklin said something like, yes, if you can keep it.
Fantastic.
And that's where we are. I mean, it's had a great run. It had a great run, but we're not far behind what you're going at all. And, it could turn around next election.
So let's talk a little bit about the contemporary context now. What things look like today. I mean, of course, I think there are so many lessons to be learned from thinkers like Adam Smith and the work that they really brought together. I mean, Adam Smith is probably, at least for me, one of my most cited economists, especially when I'm talking about free trade and the division of labour and the pin factory and all of these fantastic concepts. What lessons do you think can be learned from Smith? And actually also, if I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think Smith might have thought of the developments in 2025?
I think he would be upset about the centralization of power and the growing consolidation of power. And this relates to two of the principles on our 5 principles list: subsidiarity and divided and balanced government, because that's really, part of the brilliance and beauty of the American Constitution, is the way it really did create checks and balances, so that even if one part kind of goes rogue, it won't really be able to run amok. Now, unfortunately, finally, I kind of feel like things are just running amok, but it did take a long time. And by human history standards, like I say, it had a pretty great run. So I think he would be upset about that. I think it's even more centralized and consolidated in Britain today, and increasingly in the EU. I think that's Brussels' agenda. Absolutely. And he's got great arguments against all that. When you have decentralized subsidiarity, free market, competition, choice, voting with your feet in the sense of moving to the better place, and so on, you have healthy feedback mechanisms, like profit and loss in the market, which tend to create correction. So there's corrective mechanisms in the system. But does politics have that? Does consolidated government have that?
Well, I was about to say the sort of the public choice theory angle around democratic institutions, and the fact that democracy isn't a perfect sort of synthesis for people's perspectives, and of course it can't always take on their preferences, and that's why markets are incredibly moral from a philosophical perspective, because you can cater for every single person's preferences.
Yes, right. The democratic mechanism provides some kind of feedback. And actually, I've grown in my esteem and regard for that mechanism lately, especially as democracy's been abused lately. But you're right. There's not really nearly as much of an invisible hand in politics, in correcting politics, as there is in correcting free market, private market activity.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's interesting in the broader context of the way in which a lot of Western countries, I mean, the path in which a lot of Western countries have gone down. I mean, the UK and the US are specific examples of that, where the state is bigger than ever before. We are taxing people more than ever before. We are regulating people than ever before. We are driving people out. And actually, there seems to be in the sort of the what we would used to call the third world or sort of developing countries, where there is this sort of emergence of a new world order in which so many of these countries are now doing significantly economically better off. It's interesting. I was talking to somebody about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement the other day and thinking about, you know what, perhaps, you know, if countries in the African continent are able to really reestablish the rule of law and sort of property rights and sort of those institutions, perhaps they, you know, that's really where the future could be. So I was wondering, you know, there's this kind of concept of the new form of government that you referenced, Smith spoke about specifically. Do you think that there are any sort of modern examples of that? I mean, I'm thinking about Argentina's Javier Milei and sort of other examples. Do you think that there are these new forms of government emerging?
I guess I don't think of them as a new form of government as an attempt to restore a worthy but kind of lost older form. What's now for us an older form, but from 1776 it was rather new. So, and you know, Tocqueville in the 1830s, he applauded America and democracy, or you know, he accepted democracy. He had mixed feelings about democracy. But he kind of foresaw what might happen. He warned us about kind of like what we're seeing.
I love the authoritarianism. I like Tocqueville's perspectives on the French Revolution. I think they are particularly revealing when it comes to that. And I think that there are some parallels there with the US, because the new developments of government and the institutions that were developed. Whereas in the French Revolution, there were so many ideas. Of course, we're thinking post sort of Enlightenment period, and there are also during the Enlightenment period. But then there are so many ideas there. Whereas the American Constitution was almost certainly based on these five principles that you've outlined. I mean, even just the concept of liberty as a whole, preserving individual liberty and preserving property rights and preserving that kind of relationship between the state and the individual. Why do you think that has, I don't want to say eroded, I think that's a bit of a harsh term, but almost certainly weakened over the last sort of century or so?
That's a super big question. And it's hard. There's just kind of like a way you might describe history in the last, well, 250 years or whatever it is. It's a big question. I'm going to duck that one. It's so huge. I don't even know where to begin. It'd probably be incoherent, and I don't want to start sounding crazy.
That's okay. That's probably an entire book in itself, I suppose, as to why we've gotten into big government. Just to sort of conclude a little bit here. I mean, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. So what do you think if Smith could see America today, what do you think he would have thought in terms of the prospect for expanding liberty? I mean, there are so many organizations, academics as yourself, that are writing about this and writing about the real importance for economic liberty, for free trade. I mean, obviously, we had Trump's so-called Liberation Day, which was far from liberating, where he imposed huge swathes of tariffs on American imports. What do you think Smith would have thought about that? But also, would he have been as optimistic about America's future? Do you think the concepts and the constitutional sort of integrity is going to be enough for preserving that kind of liberty?
I'm inclined to think he'd be a lot less pessimistic, a lot less optimistic. So I guess more pessimistic. Yeah. Things have changed a lot since then, and we've sort of lived through a lot, which he may have kind of anticipated without elaborating, but it's not clear. Tocqueville sees so much, he sees things happening. So this is 50 years later. That really kind of like track, I think, what starts happening, especially in the 20th century. So it's a little hard to say exactly what Smith would make and diagnose,
What do you think he would have thought of Trump?
Well, he would have been appalled by just the whole character of our politics, I think. I mean, I guess there was some pretty appalling stuff going on in his day too, like Wilkes and the Wilkes gang. Not yeah. I don't know. I mean, politics is always a matter of lesser evil. I think he was super attuned to that and very attuned to look. Government, in a sense, is always not always, but by and large, a sham and a menace. But it's always a matter of lesser evil, and it's just like it's like something like death. Like it's not really optional. It's not really something that you justify that we're going to die and that we have to deal with death. But it's something we try to manage.
I think that's a fantastic sort of synopsis for us to end on. Thank you so much.
Optimistic note.
Optimistic note. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was really, really fascinating. And I think it was particularly interesting to go through some of those concepts and ideas that you and your co-author wrote about. And thank you to all of our watchers and listeners. If you're interested in reading Daniel and Michaela's article, then please do check out the volume, I think it's 45.2 of Economic Affairs. And you can find all of those links on the IEA website at iea.org.uk. And if you're interested in being more involved with the IEA, learning more about our work, then do check out our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk.